Adam Parker had been metal detecting for 3 years, finding nothing but bottle caps and lost wedding rings. But on this foggy October morning in the hills outside Millbrook, Virginia, his detector started screaming over something buried deep in the earth. As he brushed the dirt away from the tarnished metal, he froze. It was a military dog tag, and the name etched into it made his heart skip a beat. The name was familiar, impossibly familiar. But this couldn't be right? Because that person had been missing for 60 years, and everyone believed he was dead. Adam Parker had been metal detecting for 3 years, finding nothing but bottle caps and lost wedding rings. But on this foggy October morning in the hills outside Millbrook, Virginia, his detector started screaming over something buried deep in the earth. As he brushed the dirt away from the tarnished metal, he froze. It was a military dog tag, and the name etched into it made his heart skip a beat. The name was familiar, impossibly familiar. But this couldn't be right? Because that person had been missing for 60 years, and everyone believed he was dead. Adam's hands shook as he sat in his truck outside his grandmother's house, the dog tags warm in his palm. The small brick house on Maple Street had been Sarah Thornton Parker's home for 43 years, and its walls held more family history than any museum. Adam had always loved visiting here, surrounded by photographs and stories that connected him to generations of Thorntons he'd never met, but today felt different. Today, he was carrying news that would either bring closure or shatter everything his grandmother believed about her beloved brother. Sarah answered the door wearing her favorite lavender sweater, the one she claimed brought out her eyes. At 88, she was still sharp as a tack, with silver hair that refused to stay in place and a smile that could light up a room. But Adam noticed how her smile faltered when she saw his expression. "Adam, honey, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. "Grandma, I need to show you something. Maybe we should sit down." Sarah led him to the living room, where Jimmy's photograph occupied its place of honor on the mantelpiece. The black and white image showed a young man in uniform, barely 21, with Sarah's same bright eyes and a confident smile. Next to it sat a folded American flag, the one the military had given the family when Jimmy was declared dead. "I was metal detecting this morning," Adam began, his voice uncertain. "On the Whitmore property. I found something." He pulled out the evidence bag and watched his grandmother's face change as she recognized what he was holding. The color drained from her cheeks, and she reached for the back of her chair to steady herself. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Jimmy's tags. But how? How is this possible?" Adam helped her to her chair and knelt beside her, still holding the bag. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Grandma, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Jimmy's disappearance. Everything." Sarah's eyes never left the dog tags. He was reported missing in December 1944. Somewhere near the German border. His unit had been advancing, and then? Nothing. The army said he was probably killed in action, but his body was never found. We held out hope for so long, thinking maybe he'd been taken prisoner, maybe he'd lost his memory. But as the years passed, what about after the war? Did anyone ever come to the house? Military officials, other soldiers from his unit? Sarah frowned, her weathered hands smoothing her skirt. There was a man who came by in 1946. Said he'd served with Jimmy. Lieutenant Morrison? Morimoto? Something like that. He brought us some of Jimmy's personal effects, letters, a photograph, his fountain pen. Said he'd been carrying them when he was found. Adam's pulse quickened. Found? I thought you said Jimmy was never found. Well, that's what this lieutenant said. That Jimmy's body had been recovered, but there had been some mix-up with the records. He said Jimmy was buried in a military cemetery in France, and that the family would receive proper notification soon. But we never did. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Adam studied his grandmother's face, seeing the confusion and pain that had been buried for decades. "Grandma, what if Jimmy never made it to France?" Sarah looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The Whitmore farm. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned that there was military training there during the war. What if something happened during training? What if Jimmy never shipped out?" Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "But we got letters from him. From overseas. He wrote about France, about the other soldiers, about the fighting. Do you still have those letters?" Sarah nodded slowly and disappeared into the back bedroom. Adam could hear her moving things around, opening drawers and boxes. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box tied with a faded ribbon. "I've kept everything," she said, setting the box on the coffee table. "Every letter, every photograph, every piece of paper the army sent us." Adam opened the box with reverence. Inside were dozens of letters, their edges yellowed with age, along with official military documents, photographs, and small personal items. He picked up the first letter, dated October 1944, and began to read. The handwriting was definitely Jimmy's. Adam recognized it from birthday cards and school papers his grandmother had shown him over the years. But as he read, something felt wrong. The descriptions of France were vague, almost generic. The details about military life seemed to come from training manuals rather than personal experience. "Grandma, do you remember Jimmy being particularly interested in geography or military history before he enlisted?" "No, not really. He was always more interested in literature and poetry." "Why?" Adam held up one of the letters. "These descriptions of France. They are very detailed, but they don't feel personal. It's like he's describing postcards rather than places he's actually been." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes sharp despite her age. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure yet. But I think we need to find out more about that lieutenant who visited you. And I think we need to talk to Mrs. Whitmore about exactly what kind of military training happened on her property." Adam carefully returned the letters to the box, but kept one, the last one the family had received, dated just 3 days before Jimmy was reported missing. Something about the tone was different, more urgent, and there was a strange reference to the experiment that didn't make sense in the context of regular military operations. As he prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed his arm. "Adam, what if we don't like what we find out?" He looked at his grandmother, this woman who had carried the pain of her brother's loss for 60 years, and made a decision that would change everything. "Then at least we'll know the truth." The Millbrook Public Library's local history section occupied a quiet corner of the building, its shelves lined with dusty volumes and cardboard boxes full of photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings. Adam had spent countless hours here during his teaching career, but today he was searching for something specific, any record of military activity on the Whitmore property during World War II. Margaret Whitmore had been more than helpful when Adam called to ask about the training exercises. At 74, she was the third generation of Whitmores to own the property, and she'd grown up hearing stories about the war years from her father and grandfather. "Oh yes," she'd said over the phone, her voice crackling with age. "Daddy used to talk about the soldiers who came to train on our land. It was all very secretive," he said. "They'd arrive at night and be gone by morning." This went on for about 6 months in 1944. Now, sitting at a wooden table surrounded by boxes of archived materials, Adam was trying to piece together what kind of training had been so secretive that it left no official records. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had been particularly helpful, even pulling out materials that weren't normally available to the public. "Your best bet is the newspaper archives," she'd suggested. Sometimes the local papers picked up on things that didn't make it into official records. Adam had started with the Millbrook County Gazette, working backward from December 1944. Most of the wartime coverage focused on local boys serving overseas, victory gardens, and scrap metal drives. But in the November 15, 1944 edition, he found something interesting. A small item buried on page 3 mentioned a training accident at an undisclosed location outside town. One soldier had been injured and transported to Richmond General Hospital. No names were given, and the article was surprisingly brief for a local paper that usually covered everything from church socials to high school basketball games. Adam made a note and continued searching. In the October 30th edition, he found another brief mention of specialized training exercises being conducted in the area, with a reminder to residents that they should report any unusual activity to local authorities. But it was the December 20th edition that made Adam's blood run cold. Hidden in the obituary section was a small notice: James Wellington Thornton, 21, of Millbrook, was reported missing in action while serving with the U.S. Army in France. He is survived by his parents, William and Dorothy Thornton, and his sister, Sarah. A memorial service will be held at St. Mark's Episcopal Church on December 28. The date was wrong. According to the military records in his grandmother's box, Jimmy had been reported missing on December 18. But the obituary was dated December 20th, and it mentioned that he was reported missing in action. How could a local paper have information that preceded the official military notification? Adam photographed the obituary with his phone and continued searching. In the January 15, 1945 edition, he found something that made his hands shake. Local family receives posthumous medal. Mrs. Dorothy Thornton of Millbrook was presented with the Bronze Star Medal awarded posthumously to her son, James Wellington Thornton, who was killed in action while serving in France. The presentation was made by Lieutenant Marcus Morrison of the U.S. Army. Lieutenant Morrison. The same man who had visited Sarah in 1946, claiming to have served with Jimmy and bringing his personal effects. But why would he have been in Millbrook in January 1945, presenting a medal for someone who had supposedly died in France? Adam's mind raced as he considered the implications. If Jimmy had died in France, why was a lieutenant from his unit in Virginia presenting medals and delivering personal effects? And why had the same lieutenant returned a year later with a different story about Jimmy's body being recovered? He spent the rest of the afternoon searching for any mention of Lieutenant Morrison, but found nothing. It was as if the man had appeared just long enough to deliver the medal and Jimmy's effects, then vanished from the historical record. As the library prepared to close, Adam gathered his materials and headed for his car. He needed to talk to someone with access to military records, someone who could help him trace Lieutenant Morrison and find out what had really happened to Jimmy Thornton. The drive home took him past the Whitmore farm, and on impulse, Adam pulled over. The field where he'd found the dog tags stretched out before him, peaceful in the late afternoon light. But now he was seeing it with different eyes. This wasn't just a field, it was potentially a crime scene. His phone buzzed with a text message from his grandmother. Found something else in Jimmy's things. Can you come over tomorrow morning? Adam stared at the message, then at the field, then back at the message. Whatever Sarah had found, he had a feeling it would be another piece of a puzzle that was growing more complex by the hour. As he drove away, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. In his rearview mirror, he saw a black sedan that seemed to be following him, staying exactly 3 cars behind. When he turned onto his street, the sedan continued straight, but Adam's unease remained. That night, he spread all his findings across his kitchen table. The dog tags, photocopies of the newspaper articles, his grandmother's letters, and the official military documents. Somewhere in this collection of paper and metal was the truth about Jimmy Thornton's fate, but as Adam studied the evidence, he realized that finding the truth might be more dangerous than he'd imagined. Someone had gone to great lengths to create a false narrative about Jimmy's death, and they'd maintained that lie for 60 years. The question was, were they still around to protect it? Adam arrived at his grandmother's house the next morning to find her sitting at the kitchen table, a small leather journal open in front of her. Her usually bright eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked as if she hadn't slept. I found Jimmy's diary, she said without preamble. It was hidden in the lining of his old suitcase. I never thought to look there before. Adam sat down across from her, noting the tremor in her hands as she turned the pages. The diary was small, the kind soldiers might carry in their breast pocket, and the entries were written in Jimmy's careful handwriting. Read this, Sarah said, pointing to an entry dated November 15, 1944. It's the last entry he made. Adam read aloud, the training is getting stranger. Lieutenant Morrison says we are part of something special, something that could end the war faster. But I don't like what I'm seeing. The other boys who've been through the advanced program come back different. Quiet. Some of them don't come back at all. Morrison says they've been transferred to classified units, but I don't believe him. Something's wrong here. If something happens to me, I want Sarah to know that I never made it to France. We are still in Virginia, and whatever they're doing here, it's not what they told our families. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft tick of the clock on the wall. Adam looked up to see tears streaming down his grandmother's face. He never left, she whispered. He was killed right here, wasn't he? Adam reached across the table and took her hand. It looks that way. But we need proof. We need to find out what happened to Lieutenant Morrison and what kind of training was really going on at the Whitmore farm. Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Then we find out. I've waited 60 years for the truth about my brother. I'm not stopping now. Adam made a decision that would change everything. I'm going to call the FBI. The FBI? Adam, what if? What if we are getting into something dangerous? Grandma, someone created an elaborate cover story about Jimmy's death. They forged military records, planted false stories in the newspaper, and had an imposter deliver medals and personal effects. This isn't just about Jimmy. This is about a government cover-up that's been going on for 60 years. 3 hours later, Adam found himself sitting in a sterile conference room at the FBI field office in Richmond, facing Special Agent Maria Santos. Agent Santos was younger than he'd expected, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Mr. Parker, she began, I have to admit, your story is unusual. You're claiming that your great-uncle, reported killed in action in France in 1944, was actually killed during secret military training in Virginia. Adam spread his evidence across the table. the dog tags, the diary, the newspaper clippings, and his grandmother's collection of letters. I'm not claiming anything. I'm presenting facts and asking for an investigation. Agent Santos examined each piece of evidence carefully, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she reached the diary, she spent extra time on the November 15th entry. "This Lieutenant Morrison," she said finally. "Have you been able to find any record of him in official military databases?" "No. It's like he never existed. But he was real. My grandmother met him twice, and the newspaper mentioned him by name." Agent Santos nodded slowly. "Mr. Parker, I'm going to share something with you that's not widely known. There were several classified military programs during World War II that involved experimental training techniques. Some of these programs were ethically questionable. Most of the records were destroyed or sealed, but there have been rumors for decades about a program called Operation Mindbridge." Adam felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of program?" "Psychological conditioning, essentially. The theory was that soldiers could be trained to withstand interrogation, follow orders without question, and perform at peak efficiency under extreme stress. The problem was that the techniques were experimental, and not all subjects survived the training." "And you think Jimmy was part of this program?" "I think it's possible. The timeline fits, the location fits, and the secrecy certainly fits. But proving it will be difficult. Most of the people involved are dead, and the records that do exist are classified at the highest levels." Agent Santos leaned back in her chair, studying Adam's face. "Mr. Parker, before we go any further, I need to ask you a question. Are you prepared for the possibility that your great-uncle wasn't just a victim of a secret military program? Are you prepared to learn that he might have been a willing participant in something that got out of hand?" Adam thought about his grandmother, about the 60 years of grief and unanswered questions. "I'm prepared for the truth, whatever it is." "Then I'll make some calls. But I want you to be very careful. If Operation Mindbridge was real, there are people who have spent decades keeping it secret. They won't be happy that you are asking questions." As if to emphasize her point, Adam's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop digging or you'll end up like Jimmy." Agent Santos saw the message and her expression darkened. "Mr. Parker, I think you should consider protective custody." But Adam shook his head. "I'm not hiding. Jimmy deserves better than that. He deserves the truth." 2 days later, Agent Santos called with news that changed everything. "We found Lieutenant Morrison," she said. His real name was Marcus Steinberg, and he was a psychiatrist working for the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA. He died in 1987, but before he died, he left a detailed confession with his attorney, to be opened only if his involvement in Operation Mindbridge was ever discovered. What did the confession say? That 23 soldiers died during the experimental program, and that their deaths were covered up by creating false records showing they'd been killed in action overseas. Lieutenant Morrison, Dr. Steinberg, had been racked with guilt for 40 years. He named names, dates, and locations. Jimmy Thornton was one of the 23. Adam felt a mixture of relief and rage. So he was murdered. He was killed during an experimental procedure that went wrong. According to Steinberg's confession, Jimmy had been selected for the program because of his psychological profile. He was intelligent, creative, and independent-minded. The kind of person they wanted to turn into the perfect soldier. But his independent thinking also made him resistant to the conditioning. When he started asking questions, they increased the intensity of the treatment. His heart stopped during the procedure. And the cover-up? Steinberg was ordered to create a false identity, visit the families, and sell the story that their sons had died heroically in France. He was given forged personal effects and medals to make the story believable. The families would grieve, but they'd also be proud. It was considered a kindness. Adam thought about his grandmother's 60 years of proud grief, her belief that Jimmy had died fighting for his country. In a way, maybe he had. What happens now? Now the real work begins. We've located the burial site on the Whitmore farm. Ground-penetrating radar shows multiple graves in the area where you found the dog tags. We'll be conducting a full excavation, and the families of all 23 soldiers will be notified. After 60 years, they're finally going home. As Adam drove back to Millbrook, he thought about the phone call he'd need to make to his grandmother. The truth she'd waited 60 years to hear wasn't the truth she'd expected, but it was the truth nonetheless. Jimmy hadn't died in France, but he died serving his country. And now, finally, he was coming home. The black sedan was back, following him again, but this time Adam wasn't afraid. The truth was out, the investigation was official, and Jimmy's story would finally be told. Some secrets, he realized, were too big to stay buried forever. At the Whitmore farm, construction crews were already setting up. In a few days, they would begin the careful process of excavating the graves and identifying the remains. 23 families would finally have closure, and 23 soldiers would finally receive the honor they deserved. But for Adam, the real victory was simpler. He'd kept a promise to his grandmother, and he'd given his great-uncle the voice he'd been denied for 60 years. Sometimes, that was enough.